This month's Where'd the Road Go is sponsored by 4 awesome people: Allison Cook, Super Inframan, Indrid Cold, and 36 Dingo. If you want to become a patron, www.where'dtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And I am joined tonight by Wren Collier.
Hey, everyone.
And Red Pill Junkie.
Buenas noches.
Red Pill, who is existing in a spring-like condition, versus Wren, who just drove home in an ice blizzard.
Yep.
So, also, Miguel just told me they got rid of daylight savings time in Mexico. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, probably the only thing this government has done that I actually approve of.
See, I don't think it should exist if you're below like a certain parallel, but like up here in the north, I actually really like daylight savings time because finally it's like at 6 o'clock, it's still daylight outside.
I want them to leave it in daylight savings time.
Yeah, that would make sense.
But anyway, so we did the show on Roswell a couple of weeks ago, and now I wanted to follow this up with a conversation about the Hill case. And Wren, you've done a bunch of research on this, and I know Red Pill knows the case pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
I did at one point, but it was like a lot of this stuff. It was such a big case that after a while, I just didn't care anymore. Not to dismiss it, but just like, yeah, okay, the Hill case. There's only so much you're going to get out of that at this point. So, Wren, you are leaning more toward this having been a psyop.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, I was much less skeptical about the Hill case and, took it as an example, I think like a lot of people do, of an alien abduction. The more I read about the case and the more I sort of immerse myself in a lot of like parapolitical type stuff, looking at the history of MKUltra, stuff like Martin Cannon's The Controllers, the more I tend to think that the Hill case was a military abduction. And I don't know if do you want to kind of like go over the case itself before we get into
that's what I was just going to say. Well, one of you cover, what exactly happened for anyone who may not know.
And I hope you don't expect me to do it. I mean, you say that I know the case pretty well, and like you, I think the particulars of the case, but I wouldn't be able to say like dates and everything.
Well, I have the page pulled up, which is a great reference. So, the basic idea is that Betty and Barney Hill had taken a trip to Niagara Falls in Montreal. They were from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And this was in September 19th and 20, 1961. So on the way driving back from Montreal and Niagara Falls, near Lancaster, New Hampshire, they observed a bright light in the sky. Barney stopped the car to take a look at it. They looked through some binoculars. Betty looked through some binoculars and saw an odd-shaped craft, multicolored lights travel across the face of the moon. Betty thought that she might be seeing a flying saucer. She knew about flying saucers because her sister had seen one several years before this.
Yes.
Barney thought that what he was seeing was a commercial airliner traveling towards Vermont on its way to Montreal. But then he changed his mind as the craft rapidly descended, started moving towards their direction. And later he said that, he realized it wasn't a plane. So they got back in the car, continued driving. They said the object came even closer to them. And eventually at one point, the object passed over a restaurant and signal tower on top of Cannon Mountain. Betty testified that it was at least 1.5 times the length of the granite cliff profile, which would be about 40 feet long, and that the craft seemed to be rotating. And they sort of just observed it as it moved radically across the night sky. About 1 mile south of Indian Head, New Hampshire, they said the object rapidly descended towards their vehicle, causing Barney to stop in the middle of the highway. It hovered about 80 to 120 or 100 feet above the Hill's car and reminded Barney of a huge pancake. Using his binoculars, Barney looks into this craft, and apparently this craft had like windows that he could see into. And he saw 8 to 11 humanoid figures seeming to look at him. All but one of the figures kind of moved away from the window, and the one remaining figure like communicated a message to him telepathically. At least this is what Barney's recollection was. that he should stay where he is and keep looking.
Mm-hmm.
So he had a recollection of observing these humanoid forms wearing glossy black uniforms and black caps. Eventually, they see the craft leave and they drive home. They didn't really think of anything unusual, but I don't know. Some of the stuff in this article is like I don't agree with. So
I don't agree with that either. I think that Barney kind of like got freaked out about it. You know, he like threw the binoculars and rushed to the car, and he said to Betty, "We gotta get out of here. They're gonna capture us." So he started speeding as fast as he could to, you know, the down the mountain or whatever. And I think that both of them heard a beeping sound, an intermittent beeping sound, and after that they kind of like lost track of time. You know, they suffered what is now universally called missing time. And they realized that they arrived home exhausted. Neither of them want to talk about the thing. They didn't even want to bring their luggage up home. You know, they just went straight to bed. And you know what else? After that, I think maybe they discussed the event with just a handful of friends. One of them, I guess, was a member of the Air Force who suggested to them to report the sighting to Project Bluebook. And you know, I don't know if we want to discuss more of the particulars or we can, you know, go straight to how they started to develop, you know, problems. You know, they were irritable. You know, they suffer from insomnia. You know, especially Barney started to experience welts in his groin, and Betty was experiencing nightmares similarly related to the experience, in which she kind of like remembered, you know, brief passages of what seemingly happened after they heard the beeping sound and they stopped the car. You know, and because of that, they ended up seeking the services of Dr. Benjamin Simon, who was a famous psychiatrist and hypnotherapist who was experienced in treating people with what was then called shell shock, what we will now call post-traumatic stress disorder with war veterans. And Dr. Benjamin Simon treated them for I don't remember how many months separately, you know, and he induced a sort of hypnotic block to their memories, so they wouldn't remember the sessions after he like returned them to normal consciousness, and gradually, you know, he let them remember, you know, what transpired in the sessions. I think that a few of them are available on YouTube, and they are really, really interesting. You know, you can hear Barney's distress. He literally screams, you know, during one of those regressions.
Yeah.
It is famously known that Simon was a skeptic of the UFO phenomenon. He didn't believe the idea that they were actually taken by UFO occupants. He believed that they were suffering from some kind of like a common delusion what was induced by Betty's dreams. You know, like somehow Betty had infected Barney with this, you know, delusion. But neither of them really believed that. You know, they were adamant that wasn't the case. And in the end, you know, after, you know, because of the treatment, they managed to get better, which was, you know, actually the point. You know, the point wasn't to try to prove that they had been abducted. The point of the treatment was to try to help them ease from the amount of stress they were suffering.
Right.
And I don't know if you, Wren, wanted to discuss how the case actually became known outside of their small circle of friends.
Well, are you talking about like Fuller and the Interrupted Journey?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the fact that there was a journalist writing for some local newspaper who was a member of the UFO group that Betty and Barney ended up becoming involved with, and you know, that's why this journalist, I believe, ended up learning of that experience, and that's why he wanted to write an article about it. And at first, I think that Betty and Barney heavily opposed to it, but they weren't able to stop it. You know, the article for printing it, and because of that, is because they ended up contacting John Fuller in a way to like get in control of their own story, as it were, which, makes sense. Okay, the story is going to be known. We wanted to tell it our way, and that's the origin of Interrupted Journey, which became a bestseller, and it is universally known as the first public account of classic alien abduction.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, you make it sound like the Fuller's involvement with this was organic, but
Probably
I'm
not.
kind of of the same opinion of like Nick Redfern, that Fuller was like deeply involved with the CIA, and that he was probably assigned to do this, and it was like part of that larger project to put the alien abduction narrative and myth like out there.
Didn't we talk about that on another show, Seriah? How people say, "Oh yeah, Fuller was a member of the CIA," but I think that what we talked about is that he wasn't doing anything nefarious within the agency. So.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm just the kind of person who thinks anything the agency's involved with is nefarious.
That's fair.
That's fair, but I think, as well, I'm sure there are a lot of nice secretaries and archivists working for the agency that are not trying to brainwash you.
But also, if you're working for the agency, they're not necessarily going to put like some high status on you if they're trying to infiltrate something. You know what I mean? Like they're intentionally gonna give you a title or a job description that seems like you're harmless.
Yeah, and it's also possible too that Fuller wasn't CIA himself; he was just like a subcontractor. Because like to kind of around that same angle, one thing you didn't mention was that one of the reasons that Betty Hill wrote to Donald Keyhoe about this and kind of got introduced to Simon was through their friend, Major James McDonald, who was United States Air Force intelligence. Apparently, McDonald had befriended them sometime before this happened.
Yeah, and I told that he was the one who recommended them to report the sighting to Project Bluebook, and I think that Barney talked to some, secretary or something for a number of hours by a telephone. Describing.
Yeah, and Betty herself wrote a letter to Donald Keyhoe, and apparently within 24 hours of that, like Keyhoe arranged for the Hills to be visited by a bunch of top-level scientists, including C.D. Jackson, who was Eisenhower's deputy chief of psychological warfare. If people aren't familiar with Charles Douglas Jackson, you should check out his Wikipedia page because there's a lot of really interesting stuff that he was involved with. He was a senior executive of Time Incorporated. He was a government propagandist and expert on psychological warfare. He was key in establishing the Bilderberg Group. He was one of the key members or key defenders of Radio Free Europe. He also was the guy who purchased the Zapruder film and threw it into the Time Life vault as a way to protect the integrity of the film. So C.D. Jackson has his fingers in all sorts of spooky stuff going on in the 60s and 70s. And actually, he died in 64, so not 70s, but like in the 50s and 60s. But McDonald, tells them to call Keyhoe. Keyhoe brings in C.D. Jackson, who's a psych warfare guy. Apparently, Jackson already knew McDonald, and then he interviewed the Hills. Apparently, it was C.D. Jackson who suggested that hypnotic regression could be a way for them to recover these memories.
And that is not what Stan Friedman and Kathleen Marden wrote on Capture, the Betty and Barney Hill. Here they say that it was McDonald, the one who suggested the hypnosis.
Well, I'm not sure how to square that circle because this source is saying that Jackson was the one who suggested hypnotic regression and introduced them to Simon. And it is kind of, I don't know, Simon's kind of strange himself. I don't necessarily think Simon was nefarious at all, but it is interesting that it was arranged for like an army therapist, right? Like an army psychiatric expert. Because at the time, Simon was working for the U.S. Army.
Right.
Why wasn't a civilian doctor given the job or recommended? It's just, I don't know. That seems suspicious to me.
Well, like I said, his friend is within the military, within the Air Force, and say, hey, I know this guy who's treating, veterans. Why don't you give them a call? It could be something as simple as that. And Simon had an impressive record, and maybe the Hills felt comfortable with having someone like that treating instead of us. I don't know. And Simon was a civilian. It was just a civilian treating servicemen.
Yeah. I do think there's an interesting thing, too, in that Simon was in Boston, which was a hotbed of MK Ultra research. I'm trying to look for the reference to that.
And who knows how many people were involved in MK Ultra that we don't know about.
Sure. I mean,
My
Boston was
notes are all like scrambled.
where Harvard, Massachusetts, all the Ivy League school, so it makes sense that the CIA will put some kind of like network where you can get the biggest brains available.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that got me on this track, apparently I hadn't read like the controllers years ago, but I remember years like back in 2016, I was playing around with the idea that this was some kind of military thing, because I was reading the Interrupted Journey like again back then, and I remember I picked it out in the book here. There's this part where they're trying to get Betty into the craft. She's got like the two next to her, and what does it say here? Yeah, so they're trying to get her inside. Apparently, she's like resisting. And one of the persons leading her into this craft says, he seems to get angry. And he says, "Oh, go on. The longer you fool around out here, the longer it's going to take. You might as well go on and get it over with and get back to your car. We haven't got much time either." And I remember reading that and thinking, that's a pretty human thing to say.
Yeah.
Is this from Interrupted Journey?
Yeah, it's from Interrupted Journey. That's page 159. It's one of Betty's regressions.
Well, I mean, it's a regression too, so I mean that data is going to be subject to not being accurate.
Yeah, and then there's another part right after that too, where she says, "What are you doing, Barney? Bring him in here where I am." And the men said, "No, we only have equipment enough in one room to do one person at a time. And if we took you both into the same room, it would take too long. So Barney will be all right. They're going to take him into the next room. And then as soon as we get through testing the both of you, we will go back to your car. You don't have to be afraid." And it's just, it's like, so it's such human speech.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not what I would expect an extraterrestrial, even an ultra-terrestrial to talk like,
Yeah.
But that sounds like some military guy, like telling her what they're going to do.
Well, I mean, one thing about the thing that I'm fascinated about the Hill's abduction and also the Vilas-Boas abduction in 1907, comparing it to what it will be now the stereotypical modern abduction, is like you're pointing out, there is a difference in the level of control that the entities seem to exert over the witnesses. In Vilas-Boas' case, the UFOnauts need to like wrestle him, literally tackle him out of the tractor, and drag him by the craft. Whereas, in the modern abduction is like what you hear is almost like the aliens exert some kind of like total mind control over the individual, and their orders are irresistible.
Yeah.
So obviously, the nuts and bolts guys say, well, the aliens got better at it. With time, they got the knack of it and how to like subdue us humans the way that, biologists try. The first time they tried to tranquilize the polar bear, and we didn't get the dosage of the tranquilizing, darts. But we need to put more of it. I don't know. Like here, I guess I'm going to play the role of devil's advocate, not because I'm against necessarily the idea of the Hill's abduction being a psyop. Like I'm being totally agnostic about it. It's an interesting idea, but it's as unprovable, in my humble opinion, as the notion that it was an actual, some type of test conducted by extraterrestrials from Zeta Reticuli.
Unless you had a whistleblower,
right,
who blew the lid on it. Are you familiar with Bosco Nedelcovic?
Yes, I remember listening to Aaron Goulias' one of his podcasts. He mentioned the guy and the ideas he had about it, and how I think he was Hungarian.
Yeah, he was an interpreter for the American Defense College in Washington. And in 1978, and Tanner F. Boyle on Twitter wrote a really good thread about this guy. So go follow him if you're on Twitter. He's a hell of a guy, and he does really good threads on this kind of stuff. But he wrote about this. In 1978, this guy contacts UFO researcher Rich Reynolds, and he does some interviews. Nedelcovic basically describes that as like under sort of the guise of USAID, he was working with the CIA to carry out staged UFO abductions in South America. Specifically, he relates one that he did in Brazil. So it's interesting that you bring up the Vilas-Boas case.
Yeah.
So what he says, basically him and a crew of operators get into this like helicopter that's outfitted with electronic gear, thermal scopes, medical equipment, and they're flying over the Rio Grande River, looking like scanning with sweep lights, and they just, they found someone. It was like 3 a.m. or so. They found someone on the thermals. They descended to about 200 feet and released larays of him, like a mist of larays of him, onto the person, and then landed the helicopter. He said that the person was not immobilized by this and started to run. The 3 AID men left the rear hatch and chased the man. They caught him at the far end of a furrowed field and dragged him back to the helicopter. The man was groggy and fell face forward, hitting his lower jaw on the helicopter ramp rung. One of the AID men helped him to the helicopter. And then he was in the helicopter for about 2 hours. And Nedelcovic didn't see like what they were doing with him. He just knew that they were in there for a while. That's interesting for the Vilas-Boas case because Vilas-Boas mentions hitting, he gets tackled and dragged into this thing. And he also mentions getting his head hit as he starts to go into it. So, I mean, it sounds like Nedelcovic is talking about the Vilas-Boas abduction here.
Yeah, well, it sounds like playing devil's advocate. It sounds like Bosco. I can't pronounce his last name. He gave his testimony in what, 1978?
Yeah, that was in 78. Yeah, I mean, it's totally possible he was. And
the Vilas-Boas case was published in short after the Hills case became public. We're talking 1963. So my point is, the testimony of the whistleblower came afterwards.
Yeah.
So one can allude that, well, maybe this guy just taking a UFO story and is giving it this spin, and say, well, it was the psyop. Unless he could provide more tangible evidence, it is an interesting story, but it is remains a story.
It does come after the fact, yeah. So it's difficult. I mean, Tanner's got a whole thread about Nedelcovic and the other spooky stuff he's involved with. So I encourage people to read up on him. But Nedelcovic also apparently in a separate interview said that the Hill case was like the same deal, that the CIA was engaged in concocting like fake UFO events, and that real UFO events had occurred, but hundreds of UFO episodes worldwide had been simulated by the CIA using experimental technology, mind-altering drugs, and psychological inducements.
Right.
But the question there, and this is the thing I've tried to figure out too, is like why?
Yeah.
Like what is the end game here?
Right.
Well, there's just the general idea of what can we do to manipulate how people think. With the Hills, you had a mixed race couple.
Right.
So, further disenfranchising them, because if I'm not mistaken, wasn't Barney involved in political matters somewhere along the way?
Yeah, he was an active member.
So you think it was
what was that?
It was a strategy to descend?
It could be. It's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, he was an active member of the NAACP and active in the civil rights community of New Hampshire. Like, he was a figure in that movement. So, that's what Martin Cannon's theory is, that he was like, they were trying to turn him into a Manchurian candidate to spy on the civil rights movement, which I don't know. I think that's maybe going a bit far. It's not like it was that difficult for them to spy on people using less elaborate matter.
Right.
Right.
And the other thing is, we've seen how they've worked at using the UFO phenomena as cover for different things. And experimenting on people would certainly be that. It's much easier to experiment on your own people where you have access to them to see, can we convince someone, for instance, that they had a UFO experience? Are they going to see through this at any point?
We know that MK Ultra experimented illegally with civilians, unbeknownst, with the one project that we know for certain that happened is Operation Midnight Climax, in which they laced Johns. I think that's how you call them, people who go to a cat house, and they laced their drinks, they spiked their drinks with LSD in order to see what happened to them. But also, one has to remember, the government or any kind of experiment, you have to try to produce results as efficiently as possible. So, going to the brothel and spike drinks seems to be way easier than concocting a whole, scenario in which you need to have helicopters and you need to have all these people and you need to go and snatch, innocent passersby in order to do what exactly? It sounds plausible. to a skeptic, everything will be always plausible, more plausible than taking the experience at face value. Like, oh yeah, they were taken by aliens.
Yeah.
But
I guess too. Part of it.
What was that?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rick.
No. I have finished my thought. Sorry.
Okay. So I guess part of it, I think it is possible that we're talking about like cutting edge research being done using like hypnosis, seeing if it's possible to like block people's memories or implant false memories. And perhaps like the Hill case and the Vilas-Boas case, and these are sort of just examples of research being done on like the cutting edge of that type of science. And it can't be done legally through civilian means because this is potentially psychologically like damaging stuff. Like you could never ethically do this. And that, I don't know. There's a part of the Hill case where Barney says that one of the guys looks like a Nazi.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that part has always like struck me because like we know that there were a lot of Nazi scientists brought over as part of Project Paperclip.
Yep.
And some of those would have been people working in psychological warfare. And it's always sort of been, I don't know if there's ever been like hard evidence. So I'm not going to claim this is true or false. Just that I've heard this over and over again, that these same Nazi scientists were involved in things like MKUltra.
Yes, yeah, they were.
So it's just weird to me that maybe one of the scientists was part of this experiment, and that's one of those little elements that comes through that Barney was able to remember. That sounds weird on the surface, but actually makes sense in context.
Well, the thing is that this is something that he said during hypnosis regression, and he said, well, he's just referring to the way that the entities were dressed. And it is, like they were dressed in seems to be like all black uniform with the caps, and the caps is something that I find fascinating. It's not that common. You alien entities, UFOnauts wearing that cannons. I think that in the capture book they also mentioned that at one point Barney remembered the leader having red hair.
He said there was a red-haired Irish in the group.
So, how many Nazis with red hair?
Well, true. Well, they weren't actually Nazis anymore. They were they were now U.S. citizens, and so it could have been a U.S. military person who was Irish with red hair working alongside someone.
And I don't want to remember people. Maybe this is not the moment to tell that how there used to be a time where there was a lot of animosity between the black community and the Irish community.
There was a lot of animosity toward the Irish period in the beginning of the 1900s.
and with the black community period scenes.
Yeah.
I'm frantically Googling, trying to figure out if Jolly West had red hair, which I don't think he did. So. But it wasn't Jolly West.
So did the Hills actually see anything alien looking, or did they only deal with human-like entities?
Well, that's the thing, because in the beginning, Betty's dreams, in her dreams, the entities or the people that captured them had long noses. I think that they are described looking like this actor from the mid-20th century, Jimmy Durante, but then during the regressions, she totally changed her mind, and now the entities were having the not the typical gray description. It wasn't like that, but definitely they were almost noseless, big, bulging heads, big eyes, not totally dark. And I think the leader, except the leader, the other members of the crew, they had some kind of like cover on their mouths. Some kind of like a skin or something that partially covered their mouth when they talk, so you couldn't see the inside of their mouth, you couldn't see their tongue, you couldn't see any kind of like teeth. In fact,
surgical mask maybe.
Perhaps, and that's an interesting point.
And especially that changing under hypnosis. I mean, that kind of makes sense. If they think they've been abducted by aliens, the hypnosis is going to reveal a more alien look to these beings that didn't look alien initially.
Sure, and obviously the skeptics have always championed the idea that Betty was influenced by one episode of The Outer Limits.
Right.
Even though it's never been fully confirmed that the Hills watched that particular show, I don't think they were fans of sci-fi, but nevertheless, if it's in the air, if it's in the culture, maybe they're switching the channels, one Thursday night, and there's that thing, and and they see it for a few seconds, and nevertheless, it's so impactful that it gets imprinted into their minds.
Now,
it was a memory that was imprinted in them on purpose. Like they may have never seen that episode of The Outer Limits, but maybe somebody who was working on this project did, and they were like, "Yeah, we're going to make them remember this," because Barney is the one who actually remembers the creature's face. So like under hypnosis, he does the sketch of the leader, right, which has like sort of the big almond eyes and the little slits for the nose. And then while he was listening to the audio tape of his own regression, he seemed to go into a trance and then drew like the more finalized sketch where it has like the mouth and the eyes and everything. So that, I mean, I don't know. When I read that, and that's in the Interrupted Journey, and it's sort of like, it almost sounds like a post-hypnotic suggestion thing. Like, he's listening to his own regression. He goes into a hypnotic state and draws what he was supposed to draw,
Yeah, certainly possible.
I mean, that's just a theory.
Or he remembered more, details from an actual experience.
Yeah, but again, once you enter into the hypnosis, the memories are completely suspect at that point. So, like, what they remembered prior is more important than what they remembered in or after the hypnosis.
Well, one thing Tanner mentions in his thread was that Simon apparently never really intended for the Hills to take the regressions literally, like that they were actually like memories that happened. Simon had pointed out he was attempting to treat emotional trauma, not conduct an investigation and retrieve data that would prove factual.
Right. Yeah.
Which I think you mentioned, Red Pill. Yeah, that he, the Hills were adamant that this is what really happened, but that Simon wasn't trying to get any particular story. He was just trying to like help their trauma.
Exactly.
And that's kind of what Travis Walton said too, that when he got hypnotized, it was a matter of like breaking down the emotions around it was the goal, not necessarily to retrieve data.
Yeah, I mean, I really am not a fan of using hypnosis in order to try to retrieve information as a kind of like a forensic or kind of like a legal sort of tool to try to know what happened. But if it can help to alleviate trauma and to alleviate the stress that is being buried deep into the subconscious of a person, go for it. Yeah, this is definitely something that in the right hands with proper, certified professionals, not amateur ufologists.
Yeah. There was a case fairly recently, if I remember right, where someone was hypnotized and it led to them finding the location of this vehicle. And the information under hypnosis turned out to be accurate. But the problem with most hypnosis is that unless you can verify the information after the fact, then you don't know, because it has also been shown to be completely inaccurate. So it can, at times, retrieve memories we might not be able to access, but there's no way to know unless there's some way to validate it.
Yeah, This is totally unrelated, but I'm fascinated now with how the people who are pushing AI technology, like ChatGPT-4 and all that, these programs are getting more and more impressive in their powers, but at the same time, their creators still admit that there are instances in which the app will totally lie or say false information, which they hallucinations. That is the technical term that these AI technicians use when their instruments or their algorithms provide with information that they know for a fact it is uncertain, but nevertheless the algorithm treats it as factual.
Yeah, that's one of the consequences of reinforcement feedback using like when you're working with language models, because all of like ChatGPT and all of these like sort of AIs that are making the news now, these are all language models. It's an oversimplification, but they're basically just like a really advanced version of autocomplete.
Right.
What they're saying like is whatever sounds good. It doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And if they are positively reinforced with like, okay, this is good information from the human user, they'll continue to just, say complete falsehoods. Like, there was one recently where there was an article for the Gray Zone, I think, that got outed as being written using AI because it included like citations from papers that didn't exist. Like, because you can get like ChatGPT to come up with like citations for medical journals and stuff that look real. It'll even include like links.
Really?
But it's all just just made up. Yeah, it's like the paper doesn't exist if you actually go look it up, because it doesn't know what's true and what's not true. It's just trying to say something that sounds good. Yeah. It's trying to say something that you will think is true.
Exactly.
And that's how it's trained. It's doing its job.
Yeah, and I've known people, like they keep talking and they take things totally out of their rear ends, and they treat them as totally factual, even though they are total fabrications, just because they want to keep talking and they want to show you that they are right.
So
one of the interesting thing in that language model thing, because I've been talking with my girlfriend's dad, who's was an English professor who's retired now. But one of the funny things about ChatGPT is that it's really bad at writing poetry, and especially sonnets. It has no idea how to write a sonnet. And we found out that it's because the people reinforcing the language model didn't know how to write a sonnet, right? So you'd ask it to write a sonnet, it would write a thing, and during its training process, people would be like, oh yeah, that looks like a sonnet, even though it doesn't meet the rules or actual specifications of a sonnet at all. So it's not that the AI is bad at writing sonnets, it's that people are, and they positively reinforce the learning model of that AI.
Right. So Linda Weaver had sent me a message saying, I want to give you a thought. I've been reading some very disturbing chats with the new chatbots when humans interact with them too long. The chatbots seem to go off the deep end, and it just struck me. Isn't that kind of what happens when humans communicate with those entities we find incomprehensible? I'm now really wondering, what if we said to a chatbot, there are things communicating with us that we cannot understand either, and we do not know how to deal with that, like you seem to do with us?
Yeah, I honestly think that the Bing chatbot is the one that's completely unhinged and is ridiculous to interact with. But I honestly think that it was done that way on purpose as a marketing thing, right, to get people to pay attention to it. But I will say that ChatGPT does know how to speak Enochian. I've been getting it to write Enochian ritual.
Interesting. Now, getting back to the Hills, and applying what we were just saying, like what I'm still very open to is the possibility. I really think that something happened to Betty and Barney, something anomalous. And nevertheless, obviously, it's being colored and it's being interpreted and misinterpreted and distorted by the expectations of, a myriad of people, the Hills themselves, the friends in their Air Force, Dr. Simon, Fuller, a member of NAACP, Keyhoe. All these people have these expectations of, it was an aliens, they were extraterrestrials, it was a lie, it was, confabulation, they were hallucinating because they saw Jupiter. All these ideas that have been coloring and been putting on top of what seems to be a core crime experience. So that is the conundrum. That is the problem. Trying to get rid of that noise and to see if there is an actual signal, original signal there.
Yeah, it's tough because I admit that my interpretation of the Hill case is skewed by the parapolitical stuff that I've been getting into the last couple of years. I've been reading a lot about MK Ultra and Jolly West and the Oklahoma City bombing and a bunch of other stuff. And it makes me, I more readily accept the idea that it was in my lab. But in my defense, I had this thought long before I was even interested in this stuff when I was reading The Interrupted Journey and was listening to these quote unquote extraterrestrials talk to each other and talk to Betty and Barney Hill and not sound like extraterrestrials, but sound like annoyed army or, annoyed military guys.
Right.
So, and it's difficult too, because I'm a magician. I believe in spirits and magic, and I do think that real anomalous things happen. I just think this is one of those cases where that's just not what was going on.
And it's one of those cases that has set sort of the template for the whole abduction phenomena.
Yeah, like a specific kind, like the highway abduction, right?
Yeah, which I mean, if you take that template out, how different would the UFO abduction phenomena look?
I mean, I feel like you have kind of two major archetypes, right? You have this type of experience where the abductee is fully conscious and is sort of either driving or maybe, traveling somewhere and is either hypnotized or put into a trance state and abducted. And then there's the more like the Whitley Strieber communion type experience where people, or wake up in the middle of the night, right, and get abducted from their bedroom. And I'm at least of the opinion that the bedroom style abductions seem more numinous to me, like especially cases where the people are like, floated through walls or like lifted out of their bed and like floated along. Because, I have out of body experiences, and that sounds like an out of body experience to me.
Right.
It sounds like something happening in a different altered state of consciousness. Not something like the Hill case where, it sounds like they were, pulled over to the side of the road, dragged out of their car and took aboard some type of craft, had things done to them, and then were put back in their car and sent on the way.
Yet, the idea of being in a vehicle, especially in American roads, which definitely are more monotonous, more than the roads of other nations. Like, here in Mexico, you cannot tow south for long stretches. If you do that, you're probably gonna end up in a ditch. We need to take into account, how driving can get you, especially if you're tired, and the Hills were getting back from this was their delayed honeymoon. They had been married for I don't know how long, probably a year or something, and they hadn't had a chance of having a proper honeymoon because of Barney was working at the post office, and Barney had the most stressful job ever. I think that the guy had to drive like an hour and a half just to get to his work each day, in the morning. Yeah. It was horrible, but the guy was doing it, and they finally managed to get this small vacation. And Barney, being Barney, was stressed out all the time. Being a black man in a foreign country, he felt threatened every time, everywhere he looked. So he wasn't able to, relax and enjoy himself. So one has to take that into consideration. Maybe that is akin to conduce to that numinous experience that you are alluding to here, Grant. Like, for example, what is the name of the guy, the first man who flew over the Atlantic? Help me out, guys. The American pilot who flew to Paris.
Not Lindbergh, was it?
Lindbergh, exactly. And I remember reading in one of my books how Lindbergh, in the middle of the ocean, had an out of body experience. Like, he saw himself like flying on the cockpit of his plane, and just for the briefest moment, because the guy obviously hadn't slept for maybe more than 48 hours or something. And that is the kind of experience that conduces you to live out of your body and maybe feel that you get abducted by aliens.
True.
Yeah. I mean, like, just personally, that was one of the most reliable ways for me to have sleep paralysis and subsequently have an out of body experience would be like staying up, until 4 a.m. reading a book or something until I'm, I literally can't hold my eyes open anymore and sort of just like trancing out, in that sleep deprivation state. And, I haven't done any really long car rides in years, but when I was younger, I think at one time I drove from, Alabama to Fort Wayne, Indiana, pretty much nonstop. Ooh. And it was a long ways, and it was like a 13-hour drive or something. But I remember, at one point being like, I'm on the interstate. I'm going in a straight line. It'll be okay if I just close my eyes for a second. Thankfully, I'm still here to tell the tale.
Right.
But, you have those like little micro sleeps when you're that sleep deprived. I think eventually I just had to pull over and take a nap. But
I've definitely been tired enough where I've been like, well, what if I just close one eye?
Yeah. And, honestly, too, when people drive, even when you're totally aware, driving, especially a routine drive, like a route that you go on all the time, you tend to space out while you're driving. And sort of just the other day, I was going to pick up my girlfriend from work, and it's, the road I take all the time. And I know that there's 2 stop signs before I get to the end of the street. And as I was nearing the end of the street, I was thinking, like, did I stop at the second stop sign? Like, I literally just couldn't remember. I was like, I didn't just roll through that stop sign. I had to have stopped, but like, I had no memory of it. Because it's just so routine that you don't even think about it.
The robot takes over at that point. You're not consciously doing it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I think there's a very different thing going on with the bedroom invader model of this stuff than there is with the street stuff, aside from, highway hypnosis and stuff, potentially putting us in an altered state. But what else? Okay, so you have the Vilas-Boas abduction. You have the Hills. And I think that the next big one is the, what's the name of it, in 73?
Pascagoula.
Yeah, which is completely different from the other ones.
Yeah, but Nedelcovic said that Pascagoula was also a CIA thing. But, again, this is a guy who was saying this in 78, I think. Way before. So, take it with whatever grain of salt you want. But he claimed at least that it was also one of these operations. And Pascagoula is a weird one, though. I mean, I don't even know what I think about Pascagoula because it's just so strange.
And one interesting thing that I learned after reading Jacques Vallee's Forbidden Science journal is that the place where the abduction took place, the Pascagoula River, is very close to what do you call this, a shipyard where the U.S. Navy builds atomic submarines.
Oh.
Yeah, and also, apparently, according to Kit Green, this guy from the CIA, and that is one of Jacques Vallee's closest and oldest friends. Prior to the abduction, there had been reports of a USO, swimming through those waters. People saw something looked like some kind of torpedo, with some kind of light. And obviously that to the Navy was a security concern. And
Sure.
I think that's one of the reasons why they took an interest, if not to the abduction itself, and I think to the events that happened before the abduction.
Interesting.
Was Kit Green, if I got my Project Stargate history right in my head, he was the CIA guy who got assigned to validate the claims of SRI, right? Of Targ and Russell.
Yes.
Or Targ and whoever the other guy was.
Hal
Puthoff. Yeah, Puthoff and Targ. Yeah. So he was the CIA guy that they sent to investigate the claims that they were making, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that must be how he knows Vallee, because Vallee was working at SRI at the same time on the internet.
Yep.
So, I mean, when we look at models for what the abduction experience consisted of, I mean, there weren't a lot of examples of that stuff, I don't think, that I'm thinking, not that I can come to mind. I mean, you have the Travis Walton one, and then you don't see an uptick of it until people like Bud Hopkins get involved. And a lot of that seems to be very bedroom invader-ish for the most part, like a lot of those cases that then get expanded on under hypnosis.
Yeah, because intruders and missing time. But would you consider, so the Hills case has a decidedly, it exists in sort of this middle space, right? Between the space brother Adamski type contacts and the later more sinister bedroom invader type encounters. But would you maybe consider the Hills case in the same light as the contactees and Adamski and stuff? Because I've also read stuff and I don't know what I think about it yet. I haven't done enough research into it to have an informed opinion on this. But I have seen people speculate that Adamski was, basically taken for a ride by intelligence. And it has something to do with, Alan Dulles. I think he had an injunction on some of the scientists that were involved in the Adamski case or something. I had to go check my sources on this again, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that somebody like Adamski was, drugged, taken to some place, shown a bunch of crazy stuff, and then sent back. And allowed to tell this story.
The thing about Adamski, though, is that, all the stuff he wrote in his first book was in a previous book that had religious connotations and no alien stuff.
Yeah.
But I mean, any one of those contactees could have, fallen victim to something like that. And I mean, it would certainly be good for experimentation and stuff like that, because again, you have a marginalized group of people already.
And Adamski was, a small con man. Working near the Palomar Observatory, and a lot of people in the Air Force went there, to the place where he was. He had a restaurant, or he was flipping burgers there. So you could say, well, maybe this guy is the best way to the best people to con are people who are also conning.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But definitely, what you say, Brent, I definitely agree that the Betty and Barney Hill case is a crossroads but it is definitely signifies a change in the attitude of people with regards to the possibility of contact with alien intelligences, because with the Adamski guys and the contactees, the Space Brothers are all benevolent and now all asking, hey, you want to take a ride in the saucer, man? You want to go to Venus? Yeah, sure, take me away. But with the Betty and Barney Hill is the moment that the thing takes a turn and it's against your will, and it's something that is buried in your memories. And in the book Capture, I think there's a mention of a woman who actually had connections with people in the military, with people in the U.S. Navy, and she was a contactee. And when she got a hold of Betty and Barney and she began to talk to them, at one point she became very upset and said, "Oh, you got captured by the bad one," saying, "Oh, the people that captured you had nothing to do with the good Space Brothers that I know of." And she didn't want to know anything about the case. So there is definitely a before and after in UFO history that is clearly defined by the Betty and Barney Hill case.
All right, I agree with that.
Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. All right, information for you here in this mid-show break. If you have a story, a weird experience that happened to you, you want to share it with us and have us read it on a listener story show, or you want to come on and talk about it, email stories@wheredoestheroadgo.com. If you want to physically mail me anything, it's not on the website yet. I need to get it up there. It's P.O. Box 444, Ovid, New York 14521. Everything else can be found at wheredoestheroadgo.com, including how to become a patron, which gets you extra stuff all month long. If you like metal, and especially like discovering new metal, check out my music show, which is mostly metal and metal-adjacent stuff, and that's thelastexit.org. And there is an archive there that you can go through, both on the website and now on Mixcloud, which hopefully new shows will be put up on regularly. As for the book I'm working on, the autobiography at this point is going to hopefully be out by fall. That's the goal anyway. It's not going to be to the okay. So initially I was going to go up to about 2001, and if I do that, it's going to be the size of one of Josh's books. So I'm going to stop around 1995. This will ensure that it gets out sooner, and it's not so unwieldy big. Unwieldy? Yeah, okay. Matt Festa is doing the artwork. A very talented artist, and we were talking actually tonight about exactly what was going to be on the cover and the back, for that matter. You can check out his stuff at Tiamat's Garden on Instagram and Facebook. Just phenomenal artist. He's also going through and helping me flesh everything out. So hopefully, like I said, later this year, I'll actually have a book out. And instead of a 2-part, it's probably going to be a 3-part. But we'll see how things go. All right. As for recommendations, I'm going to throw you another interesting podcast. This we've talked about this on the show at some point a while ago, because they haven't had an episode since... about a year ago. Mabel. Mabel is a very strange podcast. It's very poetic. It deals with the Fae, and it does so in a very intriguing manner. Now, there's bits that get a little confusing, and there's some bits that are not that good near the end. But overall, it is definitely worth the listen. I hope they're going to do more. I didn't think they were going to do more, and then suddenly they popped up with new episodes, so that was cool. But yeah, so Mabel, just Mabel. If you're into Fae, and if you like I said, very poetic sort of writing in the way that it's structured, it's very different than anything else I've ever heard before. And I very much love this podcast. So that's my recommendation for you for this week. And now back to the show. All right, I'm here with Wren and Red Pill Junkie, and we've been discussing the Betty and Barney Hill case. But I'm also interested in, so we're talking about this potentially being a military abduction. Mm-hmm. And how much resemblance does it bear to things like cattle mutilations? Because if cattle mutilations are basically them testing cattle without permission, I mean, we're talking people rather than cattle, but it's the same type of a project where they're doing the stuff on American soil and making it look like something else.
Yeah, and I think it's for different purposes. Like I think that the cattle mutilations were because they were looking for radioactive material from nuclear tests and Operation Gas Buggy and things like that. And it was, but in a similar sense to something I mentioned in the previous segment about ethics and legality. In a similar vein, the cattle mutilations are carried out in the way that they're carried out because the government can't just go to these ranchers and be like, guys, we did an oopsie, and your cattle might be radioactive, because then they're going to have to admit that they screwed up, and then they're going to have to probably pay restitution, and there might be lawsuits and all this other stuff. Well, why not just do it, pretend it's aliens, and then, maybe take a couple credulous journalists and feed them a bunch of bullshit. And then, that way you'll have a whole story that hides what you were really trying to do, and no ranchers sue the U.S. government.
Yeah, and the fact that these mutilations have happened to be more prominent around reservation owned, land. What I want to say is that obviously thinking of the Vilas-Boas case in Brazil as psyops by the CIA. Yeah, I can totally see the American government saying, let's go to South America and do weird experiments with the natives there, and remembering what we said on a previous show, Seriah, with regards of the book Body Snatchers in the Desert. So the idea that the Roswell mythology was meant to cover these legal experiments with prisoners of war, Japanese POWs, and also people, handicapped people and people
with progeria and stuff like that. Yeah,
exactly. All these horrible mental disabilities, and use them as guinea pigs, and say, the government using these people as experiments, but saying, they're also going to snatch civilians like Betty and Barney Hill, and the rationale is because one of them is black, and we don't care. And they happen to be, people who are trying to fight for civil rights, and we don't like that. I mean, I'm trying to find the rationale here because, trying to see, the government is so evil, they can snatch any one of us and they don't give a F about it. I think that is a caricature. I think that, we are doing a disservice if we are going to that extent.
Well, it's not so much the United States government. It would be a very small subdivision of a intelligence, group.
Yeah, but there has to be accountability, or at least the fear of accountability. That's the reason why these guys, burned all those MK Ultra
sure
documents. But then,
who knows what they destroyed that we never got to see? I mean, I would think that they would have destroyed the worst stuff first.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that I've asked a lot. I don't get why the Hills might have been targeted. Because I don't necessarily, I agree with you that I don't buy that just because they were in an interracial couple, that was the reason, or that they were involved in the civil rights movement was the reason. I almost wonder, it's something that Tanner brings up in his thread, why Montreal? There's a couple weird things about Montreal also being sort of a center of this type of research. But also they traveled to Montreal in a car that had a broken trunk latch with a loaded pistol in the car. And maybe it was just a different time, but I've never tried to drive across the international border with a loaded gun. It seems a little weird. I mean, maybe you could do that back then and no one blinked an eye at it. But it's just there's some odd things about their trip to Montreal. And part of the way Betty talks about how Barney is in a trance the entire time, it sounds like she's being dragged into the craft or whatever it is by these two beings. But Barney's just walking with in a trance state. It makes me wonder if he wasn't targeted, not because of anything of his race or anything else, but that someone had identified him as a person who is susceptible to a certain kind of hypnosis or something, because we know that certain people are harder or easier to hypnotize. Some people can't be hypnotized at all. Some people are very easily hypnotized. So was it some peculiar, and I don't think that's anything I've ever seen anyone bring up before, but was it some particular medical quality of Barney that made him the target of this? this. And Betty was just, she was just there.
Let us not forget that Barney was a World War II veteran.
So there would have been records on his service and medical history and stuff that would have been available to people who had access to those military records.
Well, that, and also the fact that probably he also suffered from post-traumatic stress because of his war experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, also, could it have just been random? I mean, could it have just been like they were just waiting for the next person coming along the road? I mean, because how do you set someone up like that? You'd have to know exactly where they were going to drive and when, or just be waiting for a long time for them to show up.
Well, that's what I mean about the Montreal. That their honeymoon, their choice of destination, the distance involved, all that stuff is suspicious to me. And there's like Major McDonald, who is, the USAF intelligence guy who introduces them or, suggests they write Donald Keyhoe, who starts that whole ball rolling. At least in my big brain cannot prove this, but this is kind of what I'm going on in my head right now. I almost feel like McDonald was like a plan, right? Like he was I think they met him at a local bar or something. Like he just became friends with them like pretty recently. So it almost feels like he was put into place if they were targeted for some reason, to become friends with them. And then he could relay information back. Maybe they told him they were going on their honeymoon. I admit that's all a stretch. I don't have any evidence for any of this. I'm just speculating. But I've definitely thought that in the past. But it could also be, like you said, Seriah, it could just be completely random. They could have just been waiting for the next person to come across this rural, empty stretch of road.
Right. And
they just happened to be the unlucky people who did.
Did they have any other experience they reported after that?
Yes.
What type of experiences did they have?
One of the most interesting things about the book Capture is that Betty and Barney were trying to set an experiment, and they actually invited Jacques Vallee and his wife.
Oh, I remember this.
Over and visit them because they were trying to see if they could actually call on a UFO, at a given time. So the Vallee and his wife went there and spent the night with them. I think it was in the summer, so they had a nice evening, full of mosquitoes and such. But nothing happened. But the thing that is reported in Capture is that almost like the next night or maybe a couple of days later, when the Hills entered their home, they found on their kitchen table a big lump of ice, almost like a giant, hail stone, right on top of their kitchen table, and it apparently there was some kind of inscription engraved in the ice, some almost like some kind of message. But the Hills were so freaked out about it that they just tossed the thing into the garbage bin. They never even took a photograph or something, but. So according to Kathleen Marden, that was confirmation or that was the response to their plea. And also, she also mentions that even though they didn't have any direct UFO activity at the place where they were asking the UFOs to appear, people in other locations near them, they did report UFOs at that particular time. So okay, so maybe the UFO nuts were dumb and they showed them at the wrong location. Those idiots with their faulty maps.
Well, I mean, intent and stuff like that can start causing stuff to happen too.
Right.
So it may not have been spontaneous. I was wondering if they had any other spontaneous abduction encounters, but if they start experimenting with stuff like that, it kind of makes that not mean as much, because they could very well. I mean, if you're looking at it as nuts and bolts spacecraft, then it's one thing. But knowing that that's likely not the answer, it's kind of like, okay, so they started doing these experiments, which then make this stuff. They're basically, doing magical rituals without realizing that's what they're doing.
Well, one wonders what would have happened if someone like Bud Hopkins had been working with Betty and Barney, and instead of just probing on the events of that particular night in 1961. Maybe Bob Hopkins would have asked, "Hey, do you remember having experiences with these beings prior to the night of 1961?" And maybe Betty and Barney will say, "Oh yeah, I actually had. I saw them when I was 12." I saw them when I was like 7 years old.
Right.
Which became Bob Hopkins' thing. The
Yes.
idea that it's very rare or almost impossible for a person to have just one abduction experience. It is a recurrent thing, and not only a recurrent thing among one individual, but it seems to run among families. Members of a single family.
And that's true of the paranormal in general. Most people do not have like one isolated incident. I mean, once in a while you'll find someone who, they have one minor experience or even one major experience, but most people who have these experiences have had similar or other experiences throughout their life. Again, though, the problem with Bud is that he was getting a lot of this information under hypnosis.
Right.
So it's hard to verify any of it and determine whether or not that was genuine or something he started unintentionally creating.
Right. And getting back, for example, to the Antonio Vilas-Boas case, one thing I remember reading in a Spanish paranormal magazine called Año Cero, there were these investigators that went to Brazil in the 90s or the early 2000s to talk to Vilas-Boas's relatives because he had died by then. And I think his brother told them that they grew up in a haunted house, like they had like ghost experiences and things like that prior to Vilas-Boas's famous abduction experience. So you could say, well, Vilas-Boas had a paranormal experiences before, the case he became famous for.
Yeah, true. There was another case I was thinking of too, and now I can't remember what it was. I was thinking of the Rendlesham and the one that happened the next day in Texas. I always forget the name.
Cash-Landrum, yeah.
Which again, I mean, that has military written all over it.
Oh, for sure. Well, yeah.
So. But, they're also doing this in, okay, so let's say that the whole Rendlesham thing was a psyop, but it's also they're doing it in an area that has a history of weirdness.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that was accidental. But my
us?
Huh?
Maybe it was. I mean, maybe it wasn't accidental, or maybe it wasn't planned by the people who conducted it. What I'm trying to say is that humans are not in control of this thing. There's something else in control of this thing, and humans with their little shenanigans just add up to it. So maybe, Vilas-Boas or the Betty Hills having some kind of like involvement with the military does not negate the fact that there is a core of high strangeness at the center of all this. Same with Rendlesham, you said, maybe the Rendlesham case was 80% a psyop. There's still a 20% or a 10% of high strangeness there that I don't think it is controlled by, the controllers or the military or the government.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. The effect it has on us, perhaps, too, isn't something they can control.
Yeah.
And Peter Robbins pointed out that at Rendlesham, and he has pictures, they had a cloud buster.
Right.
And that's interesting because, of course, that was dismissed as pure nonsense, but yet here the military is with one. And why would they have it if they were not experimenting with it?
Right. Well, we know that the military sometimes experiments with things that seems to be pure baloney. Like, I want to think of the almost $500,000 that they spent to try to prove Salvatore Cesar Pai's theories about electromagnetism and anti-gravity. This is something that became known after the 2017 New York Times article, and people saw, oh, wait a minute, this is a guy who works for the U.S. Navy, this scientist Salvatore Cesar Pais, who, asked for all these patents or things that look, for all intents and purposes, like a flying saucer, an anti-gravity craft using some type of electromagnetism, propulsion. And this is something that journalists like people in the drive, and oh my God, I forgot his name. I regret it. But people learned that the U.S. Navy actually spent money trying to conduct experiments to prove this guy's theories, and the experiments amounted to nothing.
Right, right.
So it is all BS. It wouldn't be the first time that, that the government has spent money in foolishness. And I'm sure skeptics right now are yelling, like remote viewing.
But that wasn't unsuccessful. That just got packaged with other projects that were unsuccessful.
Yeah, I happen to believe that. I happen to believe that at the core of remote viewing, there was this phenomenon that wasn't really that helpful for military purposes, but it is real nonetheless.
Yeah.
See, I actually think that is in and of itself a little bit of a psyop. The idea that it wasn't useful, because it was most famously used to scout out the compound when there was still going to be an attempt to rescue the Iranian hostages during the hostage crisis.
Yeah.
They used the remote viewing team to kind of like scout the location. One of the remote viewers mentioned seeing what looked like spider webs in the trees, and what that ended up being was tripwires connected to like C4 charges that were like rigged up between trees as a way to prevent helicopters from landing in that compound. And that wasn't confirmed until later. But I think that, like, I've done my own remote viewing experiments with people who were completely untrained. And I was like sort of formally trained by this lady who was one of Lynn Buchanan's students. And so like I can tell you for certain that it works. How it works, I don't know. Like, but I've seen enough to know that like it does work and it works well. I just think like a lot of things, it just moved to the private sector because it doesn't leave a paper trail in the private sector.
Well, also, doesn't it work well as long as the remote viewer gets the results after the fact?
Yes, that is part of it. They're supposed to receive feedback. That's why any remote viewing is something that can't actually be verified is just nonsense. You're not even supposed to do that.
Yeah.
Like, that's not part of actual protocol. Like actual protocol, you can only view things that you will be able to confirm and provide that feedback to the viewer at some point.
Right.
Which, brings up the idea of time loops, right?
They're
sending information back in time to themselves. But, like the lady that did the training that I took part in, and, I don't know, maybe she was just taking me for a ride. But she did say that at one point she had to cancel class for 1 week because she had to go out with some other remote viewers to do some contract work for the government, which she told us they were doing climate modeling, remote viewing stuff for NASA, I believe. And so I think like there's still, you have like the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I still think there are a lot of groups of remote viewers that do private contracting work, corporate espionage, things for governments and stuff, but there's no formal government project anymore because, there end up being records and FOIA requests and things like that reveal it. But I think the same reason a lot of the stuff was shopped out to Bigelow and Bigelow Aerospace, right?
Yeah.
If it's all being done by a private company, well, the private companies doesn't have to release any documents as a FOIA request. So.
All right. Well, we are just about out of time. So Wren, where can people find you?
So I have a blog at liminalroom.com. You can also find me on social media at liminalbird.
What social media is it? Just Twitter?
Yeah, just Twitter. Someone there at liminalbird. And if you want to invite to my Discord server where we talk mostly about like magic related stuff, feel free to send me an email or message me on Twitter and I will send you an invite.
And Red Pill, where can people find you?
Well, they can remote view me.
Oh, excellent.
Just please do it in daytime hours. Otherwise, I'm sorry.
Where else, perhaps?
Okay, so if you don't have it in you, the faculties, you can find me on the Daily Grail, dailygrail.com. You can find me on my personal website, absurdbydesign.com. And you can also find me on Twitter, Facebook, even Instagram.
All right. Well, thank you both.
All right. Thanks, Seriah. Thanks, Red Pill.
I'd like to take a moment here to thank all of my patrons because all of you help make this show possible. And I want to give a special shout out to those of you pledging $10 or more. Billuminati, Chuck Shutters, Leanne Cherry, Matt in Delaware, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, Indrid Cold, 36 Dingo, CJ, Tim, Andrew Nichols, Matthew Sproul, Christine, a blue second gen MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain, Patricia Guy Quinta, Alex Whitcomb, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Ann Wintowski, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Big Boy Limina, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, Land of the Crazy and Communicable, Chris, Craig Cicernos, Craig Parmenter, Diane B., Empty K, Eric Todd, J. Otto Bullet, Russ Rouse, James Lattimore, James Lindsay, Jim and Sophie, John Bracken, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Schreck, Cool Kitty, Kristen L., Laser Printer Jam, Lauren McLean, Linz Jackson K., Luke Osborne, MJ Armstrong, Mark Brady, Mr. Weird, Oli Andre Olar, Patricia W., Paul Jeffries, Ray Benedetto, Riker and Stark, Ron Dupre, Sam Sharon, Seed Person 1, Stacy Sherwood, Tactical Therapist, Taylor Bell, Thunderboy, Tyler Glimstead, Vincent Trewell, Walker, Will Gebhard, Craig Sagastumi, Will Powell, Wren Collier, and Caroline Walker. Thank you all so very, very much. There is a Patreon segment along with this show that will be put up later in the week. If you want to become a patron, it's only $3 a month. It helps out the show, and you get extra content all month long, plus the shows a week early. I want to welcome Denise, who is a new Patreon this week. And again, everything can be found at wheredidtheroadgo.com. And I will see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.